Okay. Right, let's start with today's lecture. Before we start, I want to briefly mention our schedule for this week and next week. So today will be the only lecture for this week. So we will skip Thursday, and then for next week, we will skip Tuesday. So there is only one lecture, which is this one for this week, and then only one lecture for next week. And that will be next Thursday. Yeah, next Thursday. So basically the big events is coming up, and then hopefully for people who don't attend, it's your chance to catch up with whatever you haven't finished yet, also for stuff like assignments. Right, so that's regarding the schedule. Basically, we still have many things to talk about, and although we can slow down a bit, since we've covered some basics with crash courses, but yeah, from this point, from today's lecture, we will talk more about different principles. That's not necessarily directly related to writing code itself, or writing the code that actually does the work. Rather, we will talk about stuff like testing, design, refactoring code, deal with legacy code, and then DevOps, this kind of thing. And also starting from, I think, 2 weeks later, we'll also watch something related to the fundamental project management, because we've been mentioning different project workflow throughout this course, and to have some basic understanding of project management will be helpful, even though in this course we're talking about software development, because software project is one type of project, and then any project need to be managed, and then different type of project have different characters. If you read one of the recommended book, it talks specifically about project management, and it's related, right? Do we do testing? It actually depends on different priorities in the project. Although in this course, in this Berkeley course, the professor would emphasize a lot about writing tests, and then later we will talk about that a bit more. But in reality, developer, especially if it's not a technology-driven company or ministry, most likely the developer team don't have the say to say, hey, I want to do this task and then skip that task. Although we can have our voices, we can have our inputs, but again, most likely there's a different priority in terms of the business. And then, even though there's an ideal way to do software, we may not do that in a real project. So that's why a few weeks later, we will also go through some materials talking about the basic project management, hopefully to give you a better understanding of that side of things. All right, so without further ado, let's get into today's material. So today we're going to talk about BDD, or behavior design, behavior-driven design. Although the Berkeley lecture will start talking about testing already with this part, behavior-driven design. But I want to say the primary goal for BDD is to get the design right, or to get the client specification right. And of course, there's some extra bonus when we do testing together with BDD. But I want all of you to remember throughout today's lecture, the primary goal for BDD is still to do the design, to figure out the specification, working together with the client or the stakeholders. All right, that's enough for me to talk about that. Let's get into the video.
We already know that Agile is all about gracefully dealing with change, and in particular, placing more value on working closely with the customer to make sure the software evolves to serve their needs. But it can be tricky to reach agreement on exactly what those needs are, especially if your customer is non-technical. Engineers and non-engineers don't always speak the same language. That's why the Agile community came up with behavior-driven design and behavior-driven development, both often abbreviated BDD. BDD encourages customers and developers to have conversations in which they develop specific use cases or scenarios describing what the customer wants the software to do. Each scenario is called a user story, and it describes a sequence of interactions and the expected results when a particular type of user or stakeholder attempts to use the software to complete some specific tasks. These conversations result in a set of low-fidelity user interface mock-up drawings using pencil and paper to sketch how the app looks at each step of the user story, just like the storyboards of a movie. The transitions between these drawings would be triggered by user actions. For example, given I am on the Rotten Potatoes homepage, when I click the Add New Movie link, then I should be on the page to create a new movie. When I fill in the movie details and click Save Changes, then I should be on a page showing the details for the new movie I just created. When I click Back to List of Movies on that page, then I should be back on the home page. Each step specifies an action the user might take, or how the user would expect the software to respond to an action. But how do we turn those narratives and low-fidelity mockups into real code? The amazing good news for software as a service is that we can translate the stories almost directly into actual executable tests using a remarkable BDD tool called Cucumber. As we'll see, Cucumber lets you write out the sequence of steps a user would take and the results the user should expect to observe in plain but stylized English. Then it lets you associate each of those steps with blocks of Ruby code that actually exercise your real app by simulating those user actions and examining how your app behaves as a result. Now, if you've previously used testing frameworks that support integration-level tests, you might be thinking, why would I layer on a tool like Cucumber and write test cases in stylized English, rather than just writing test cases in code? The main reason is that by creating a Cucumber scenario to capture each user story, not only do you end up with an integration-level test for that story, but the expression of the test itself is understandable to a non-technical customer because it's derived directly from the meeting in which the stories were developed. So a Cucumber scenario serves not only as an integration-level correctness test, verifying that you built the thing right, but also as a user acceptance test, verifying that you built the right thing. As we'll also see, you can write the complete Cucumber scenario before your app contains the code to implement the user story and make the scenario pass. You'll incrementally modify the app bit by bit to make each line of the scenario pass, one step at a time. In other words, your development of the app will be driven by the behaviors captured in the user story, hence the name behavior-driven development. When we began teaching this course, we were concerned about how students would respond to such an unusual approach. BDD represents a different way of thinking about what a test is and a new approach to development in which you can write the whole test long before it's able to pass. To our pleasant surprise, students learned Cucumber quickly and really embraced it as a way of both testing their apps and documenting the user stories they agreed on with the customer. They even reported that writing cucumber scenarios felt more natural than creating traditional tests because the scenarios are expressed in terms of users' high-level interactions with the app. As with all the new tools and techniques in this course, we hope you'll give BDD a serious try, and we believe you'll agree with our students that it is a great way to develop customer-centric software as a service.
Okay. So before we continue, I did remember I forgot to mention. So all the videos today, the materials is coming from the second part of the Berkeley course, Module 3, BDD. So you can find all the videos here if you want to revisit some of the points. And for the first video, I do want to emphasize that what we are trying to do with BDD, or behavior-driven design, here I specifically want to talk about design side of thing rather than the development side of thing. So the primary problem we're solving with BDD is previously we talked about the gap model, right? From what the customer wants, from what the customer really wants, to what the customer thinks he wants, to what the customer says he wants, to what the developer understands what he wants, and then to what the developer actually built. Every single step there is a gap here. So by using this tool, the BDD, if we think BDD as a tool, then we're trying to close the gap between what the customer says he or she wants, versus what the developer thinks or understands that he or she wants. Because essentially a customer are typically non-technical, and for somebody non-technical to talk to somebody technical, there's usually a discrepancy going on with this kind of conversation. So by doing BDD, and specifically in plain English language to define the behaviors, rather than a developer. So typically a developer will say, okay, so on a page I will add a anchor tag with href links to some other site, and then when user click that, we will run some JavaScript that fires a tracking pixel, something like that. That's pretty technical. Whereas for someone non-technical, he or she would probably just say, hey, I want a link on a page. When user click it could also track the click, something like that. So there's typically a big gap between, even though it's the same thing, the way that developer described it and the way that non-technical personnel describe it will be totally different. And because of these two party lives in almost two different worlds, it typically introduces like misunderstanding, or for someone non-technical, it becomes difficult to understand what the developer is suggesting, and because there's a difficulty in communication, we might, as a developer, we may not be able to actually catch the point, or have the client or the stakeholder to feel comfortable enough to express his or her idea. So this is what we're addressing today with this BDD tool, is trying to close the gap using plain English that both parties can understand, but also specific enough and technical enough that we can clearly define the desired behavior of the application. So the mentality is basically we're trying to build the right thing, as the professor also mentioned, compared to build the thing right. Because if thing is wrong, the thing we're implementing, the behavior we're implementing, if it's wrong because of some kind of misunderstanding, then even we build it perfectly right, without bugs or whatever, and then it's super performance algorithm, it doesn't really matter because it's not the desired behavior. So before we talk about before we think about getting build the thing right, we need to first address how to understand what the customer really wants, and so that we can build the right thing, even though there can be bugs or whatever. That's still better than building the wrong thing right. All right, so that's for the first video. Let's get to the next one.
So let's talk about, we're kind of switching gears a little bit today. We're actually not going to do any coding today, at least I don't think so. But we're going to talk about something that I have found for most students in this course actually is the more difficult aspect of the project, which is managing how to plan the work that you're going to do. Most of you are quite good at coding because you've already done it in a bunch of classes. But as it turns out, organizing the work of a project, especially with a team and with a real customer, if you haven't done this before in industry, it's actually not it's not that it's difficult to do, it's just not obvious. So we're going to start by talking about behavior-driven design, or BDD, and user stories. And if you have taken 160 or a similar user interface or user experience course, you may have heard this term. So back when we started talking about Agile, we said one of the things that makes it work well is when the customer or the other stakeholders are people who care about the app for whatever reason, are involved during the development. They're giving you constant feedback. And that could include managers, it could include people who represent your customer. And one of the ways that they do that is every iteration you're deploying incremental new functionality and you're giving the customer the opportunity to interact with it and give you feedback before things go wrong. In real life, in industry, typically 1 week iterations are common. We do 2 week iterations for a variety of reasons. Just your schedule is so crowded that it's harder to get stuff done in a week. And instead of the waterfall, where there's sort of these 5 major phases, and once you're done with a phase, you never visit it again, you're actually doing many times through this shorter cycle, and you're visiting each phase. So you're always sort of in contact with your stakeholder, and you're validating that the thing that you're building is actually the thing they want. So the question is, how do you arrive at agreement on what that thing is? And one of the contributions that sort of came out of the Agile movement is the idea of behavior-driven design, where you're basically asking questions about the behavior of the app, which is what the customer sees, before and during development to reduce the chance that you have a misunderstanding with the customer about what is to actually be built. And early on, we talked about the difference between validation, which is did you build the right thing, versus verification, which is did you build the thing right. The main idea about BDD that I want you to keep in mind for today is BDD says nothing about implementation. It is purely focused on the customer's experience when they use the software. So one way that we do this is we try to capture what the customer thinks they want in the form of user stories, which are sort of lightweight descriptions of how the app is going to be used. Some people call these use cases, but from the point of view of a web app, you can think of it as when I sit down at the browser to exercise some feature of the app, here's kind of the sequence of events that I do, and here's what I would expect to happen, what I would expect to see as a result after each one of those steps. So it's about the behavior of the app, because the customer generally doesn't know anything about how that behavior is being implemented, and for the most part, they should not care. In a separate unit, after we finish talking about behavior-driven design, we'll talk about test-driven development, or TDD, which is about the implementation. And sort of bridging those two is what the next couple of weeks' worth of the course material is all about. So again, hearkening back to the very first week of class or so, we had this picture about the phases of the life cycle where you start each iteration by talking to your customer, which you'll have hopefully by next week. And we're going to talk about doing mockups, user stories, and scenarios. So the yellow is kind of what we're going to start talking about. I'm going to put up this slide 2 or 3 times in the next couple of lectures to sort of keep track of where we are in how you're going to do your team's work during each one of these iterations. Okay, so we're going to start with the talking to the customer part. User stories are really simple. You get a 3x5 index card, and working with the customer, you write down a thing that the app is supposed to do. That's basically the high-level description. Now, there's been a number of proposed sort of schemas, formulas for how you would write this down. We are a fan of what is called the Canextra format, after a now defunct company that pioneered it. And the Canextra format basically has 3 chunks. There's the name of the feature, and I'm going to use as an example our simple movie reviewing app, Rotten Potatoes, adding a movie. How would a user add a new movie into the database? So besides the feature name, the 3 pieces are the folder, what's the purpose, and what's the goal, right? And sometimes it reads more naturally if you maybe put them in a different order. The really neat idea, which we'll see on Thursday, probably not today, is you can essentially expand on this in a little bit of detail into the sequence of steps that the user would take to actually make this happen. If that functionality existed, what would it be like to use it? What are the forms that would appear? What would they fill out? What would they see in each case? If they entered something that was erroneous or illegal, what kind of error messages might they expect to see? All of that can be spelled out in more detail, and the cool thing is we can turn that level of detail into a runnable test. So in some sense, you're going to get a test that does double duty. On the one hand, it is a way to capture what the customer and you agreed on that they want. And on the other hand, because the test really does exercise the code, it is a test that checks for correctness, right? So it is checking both the behavior from the user's point of view and also the implementation of your code. So that'll be cool stuff. OK, so that's that. Since one of the things that I kind of promised all of you is that everything we present in this course is something that is widely practiced in industry and that we, the teaching staff, actually practice ourselves. This is a recent whiteboard photo. If you've worked at a software company, you've probably seen some version of this. This is basically a whiteboard and post-it notes version of what we're going to do with a tool called Pivotal Tracker. But using user stories as sort of the unit of describing work to be done on an application and measuring our progress on that work is kind of what this is all about. So if I zoom in on a couple of these, you can see that there's a story about business integration that says, as a product manager, I receive an accurate bill for information services each month in order to pay for what I owe. So there's the 3 pieces, right? Who am I? I'm a project manager. What's the thing that I'm doing? I want to receive an accurate bill for information services each month. And why? Because I want to be able to pay what I owe. Now, it doesn't say on the card, or the post-it in this case, why that's a story that has business value, but we'll give you a sort of heuristic so that when you're talking about stories with a customer, you can get to the bottom of what's the real motivation behind the story. Like, what if they didn't pay what they owe every month, right? Something bad would happen to their business, presumably. So that's where we're going. Where did this come from? It comes from the HCI community. And as I said, if you've taken an HCI course, you may have seen something like this before. But the reason that they settled on the sort of paper and pencil technology is it's non-threatening. So it's not technological. No stakeholder is going to feel like they don't know how to operate an index card and a pencil or a pen. So it's a kind of brainstorming that doesn't sort of inadvertently shut out people who think, oh, you're using some brainstorming tool, like you're using Google Docs. I don't know how to use that. Everybody understands how to use index cards. It's easy to rearrange them. You saw the post-its so that you can sort of move things up or down depending on their priority. And again, that's a process where the team and a customer representative can sort of participate in that. In our case, we're going to use a tool for this so that once you've collected the sort of paper and pencil version, your team will be able to do prioritization a little more nicely. The stories are short. It's got to fit on an index card. And the tool that we're going to use preserves that. The actual text of the story is just like a couple of lines. So the idea is that they're easy to change during development. If you got a story wrong, all you're throwing away is sort of one index card's worth of stuff. And this is in keeping with, let's keep everything as simple as possible, make small changes, and as quickly as we can get feedback on what those changes are, it gives us a chance to do some course correction. So if that's what a user story is, we can now ask a bunch of questions like, how do you know if your user stories are any good? What makes a good user story? What's the process by which you and the customer can work together to develop them? How do you estimate how difficult they are to do? Because if we're going to use these as the unit of making progress in your project, probably not every story is going to be as complex to implement as all the other ones. And the customer certainly is going to want to have some input in which ones are most important. If your team has limited time, there are times when you'll have to push back and say, no, we can't do all of that within the next iteration, but we'll work with you so that we'll deliver the most important things first. You'll need to be able to track who's working on which stories and sort of where in the life cycle the story is, like when might it be done. And finally, a way to verify that when the code is delivered, it actually behaves the way the story says that it would. So all of these things is kind of what we're going to spend this week on.
All right, so that's the first technology or technique we are introducing here for BDD is the user story. So as that's already mentioned in the video, user story actually didn't start with the software industry. Typically, before software was a thing, it was used in like movie making, animation, and this kind of thing. And then if you think it that way, like for movie makers or directors for a movie, that's also like when you first design the movie, you probably do that by some keyframes, and then the way you would communicate to the actor and then the cameraman and everyone doing even like post-production is that you also do that through user stories. You don't, because as a director you probably is not technical enough, or you don't have the specific skill to understand or even do certain things, but you still need to communicate your idea to team members that are more technical. So same idea here when doing software. Again, the clients are typically non-technical. So by using user story, which is written in human language or plain English, it's plain enough for non-technical to understand it, and then that's the main benefit we get from using user story. Although on top of that, there are additional benefits we get. And then from my experience, really by having a user story, it really helps to, even for a technical person talking to another technical person, it really helped me to communicate the task. So here we're saying we will be using the user stories to define features and divide tasks. Right? Basically, each user story will be associated with a task. So by doing that, it also allows teamwork. So for example, if we have a pretty big team, or let's say if I'm the lead engineer or lead designer, and then I have team members offshore, meaning like working from remote, or even freelancers working under my management, then most likely I won't be able to have everybody on the team to join a meeting to directly interact with the stakeholders. So maybe during the meetings, there are new features that are designed and specified and then need to be worked on. But then, since let's say I'm the only person joining the meeting in the team to represent everyone else on the team, then I kind of have to pass the information, the stuff that's get decided in a meeting. I need to communicate that to whoever that will be working on the task or the desired feature or desired behavior. Right? Then imagine it's a 1-hour meeting. Then most likely I need to spend another hour just talk to different people on the team to explain what's going on and then what's hard to desired behavior. But however, if during the meeting we produce a user story that is technical enough or specific enough, then it will make my life much easier communicating that task to someone else, some other developer on the team. And then actually I did that for a couple of projects, and it was really helpful compared to the projects that didn't use any form of user story or specification. So imagine, let's say we've got a new task that need to implement a feature, just a feature A, right? Then without a user story, typically what we see is, hey, developer B, could you build something that looks like the similar feature that's on another site, C, right? And then probably the developer will, okay, I will see, and then he will take a look at the site, and then depending on his or her understanding of that feature, what we end up getting from her or he can be very different from what we want, because technically what we just said is, hey, I want something that's similar to something else. But in what way it's similar, and then in what way it's different, everyone would have their own take. And on the other side, if I, the other way I could do it without a user story is go very specific. I need to say, okay, I want to implement a function. The function should take these arguments, and then it should do something with that, and then return something, and then it should show something on the page. Then in that case, I need to spend quite some time explaining and going through all that. Versus projects that already have user story developed, then it's usually very easy. Just send the user story to the assigned developer, give him or her a few minutes, and ask if he or she have got any question. If not, then go ahead and implement that. And then based on my experience, typically having a user story, I usually get results that's more desirable versus not having a user story. So in that sense, a user story primarily it helps the communication between people who are not technical and technical, but it also helps to define tasks. And then especially when we work as a team, where information needs to be passed and communication needs to happen in order to have everyone on the same page. User story could also help that to break down the tasks and provide specifications for each task. Yeah, and then minimize the effort needed in communication, especially in a team setting. Okay, we will, I believe the next video will talk some more about user story, and then hopefully we'll have a better, it will show some examples, and then hopefully we'll have a better understanding of how a user stories typically look like. Okay, let's get to the next one.
What makes user stories good? How do you know if you wrote a good user story? As you've noticed by now, the world of Agile and XP and everything else is littered with acronyms, and sometimes they make it easier to remember stuff, sometimes they don't. I think this is one of the ones that actually makes it easier. A smart user story is a good user story. So what are the S, M, A, R, and T in SMART? And we'll go through each one, but the story should be specific, it should be measurable, it should be achievable, and that one varies, but we're going to say if you can finish it within one iteration, that's achievable. Relevant, and we'll talk about what that means. In other words, why is it relevant to the customer's business? Why does it have business value? And time-boxed, which means sometimes you got to know when to give up. The story is taking longer than you thought, and it's time to back off and find out why is it taking longer than we thought. So let's go through each one of these at a time. Again, most of these are not rocket science, but if you've never had to think about it this way before, it takes a little bit to sort of get your brain into this mode. Specific and measurable. By the way, if something is neither specific or if something is not both specific and measurable, it's really hard to test it. So I'm just going to start with that. Remember that for us, one of the goals is, can we use the stories not only to describe what is to be built, but eventually to actually test by running the app that it actually functions as we expected. So this means that we have to be specific about inputs and conditions to the stories and what the expected result is. That's why, this is a sort of stupid anti-example, but the UI should be user-friendly. Well, first of all, if you have a way to measure that, then you need to rewrite the story in terms of that measurement. For example, it takes a new user, X number of seconds or X number of clicks to figure out how to do a common task. And if it's not measurable, then you're kind of sunk because you won't have any way to test if you achieve the goal or not. A little more sort of specific than that is, OK, well, suppose we break down the user story and we specify some initial conditions, a thing that is some action that's going to be taken, probably by the stakeholder, and some expected post conditions, one or more specific things that should happen as a result. That's a way of getting it a little bit more specific and measurable than just something like this anti-example. So what would be an example of something like this? Well, suppose we say, OK, I'm going to make it more specific. Let's say my Rotten Potato site also sells movie tickets. A user story might be, given tickets to some movie are available, I, as a customer, should be able to buy a ticket. OK, well, that's better because it describes a very specific action. But it's hard to tell what the main focus of the story is. Is the idea that we're trying to make sure, like from the box office point of view, that the correct computation of tickets being available is done? Is that the point? So that if you're looking at a movie that is sold out, you don't see the opportunity to buy? Or is it that the story is really about the patron has an account, and like if I buy tickets, then the next time I log in, I should see in my account that I have those tickets? Or is it just about the flow? Like what are the specific steps that the patron should take in buying a ticket, and what should happen at each of those steps? So it's hard to tell any of those things just from this formulation. What we'll see is that we start from a story like this. This is the kind of thing you would come up with your customer, and you can refine it somewhat. But eventually, you're going to get to a level where you start spinning out scenarios based on the story, and that's where you really get specific. So a scenario that might come out of this story is something like the following. It might say, given that the movie Roma is playing at my theater, and there are 20 tickets available, and I'm logged in as a patron, then if I pick 2 tickets from the drop-down menu and enter my credit card, then my account should show that I have 2 tickets. Something like that, right? So now it's specific enough because I've identified a particular set of preconditions. There's a particular movie with this particular number of tickets available. I've specified specific actions that the stakeholder would take, right? I go to the site, I pick a number of tickets, I enter credit card information, and I specified the expected post condition. After I'm done with all that, then when I go back to my account page, I should see that I have 2 tickets for that movie on that date at that time. That you can write a test about, right? You could even imagine handing a human being who's like your unpaid summer intern saying, OK, here's a script. You're going to buy 2 tickets for this movie. Go. And you can imagine having the human being sort of step through the site, do all of the actions, and at the end, they're like, yep, the site works, or oh, no, there's a bug because when I entered invalid credit card information, it let me buy the tickets anyway. And by the way, that's how a lot of sort of QA testing for websites used to be done. That is old school. You're not going to do that. We're going to automate all that stuff that I just said. And it's delightful because then when you watch these tests running, it is like experiencing a bunch of little mechanical users interacting with your site and verifying that your code is good. It is a wonderful, wonderful feeling. So there's a limit to how specific you can get with the customer in the initial meeting. But when you write the scenarios, those are going to be specific enough that they literally are turned into runnable tests. Super cool. Achievable. Let's go on to the A in SMART. Ideally, you can finish the story in one iteration. And as we'll see, there are ways that you can break up stories into pieces so that if you have to deliver a subset of stories, you can complete the entire feature later. For example, in the version that I just gave, it might turn out that all of that work is more than you can finish in one iteration. So you might say, OK, I'm going to break it up into 2 stories. Story number 1 is about the customer goes to the site, there's a particular movie with tickets, they choose, and there's a shopping cart. And by the end of the story, the goal is they see the tickets in their shopping cart, but they haven't paid yet. Then story number 2 is, given that I have a shopping cart with 2 tickets in it, however they got there, then I enter my credit card information, I pay, and then when I look at my account page, the tickets are there. So you basically find intermediate points where you can divide it into precondition, action, postcondition, end of story. New story, precondition, which is based on what should have happened before, but now you can set it up any way you want, right? So for that second story, the one that begins with, assuming I have 2 tickets in my shopping cart and I haven't paid for them yet. In that scenario, it doesn't matter how the tickets got there. In fact, you could imagine 2 different people on your team working on those 2 stories in parallel, because the second story only says somehow the tickets got in the cart. The code that would have been required to let the customer do that is not technically needed. We can force the tickets into the cart some other way just so that the story's preconditions are met. So one of the challenging things about working with stories is exactly this. It's subdividing them so that something that is too complex for one pair or one developer to do within the iteration can be broken up into nice sub-pieces, and any given sub-piece can probably be finished. Yes, question?
Okay, yeah. So you said in like the whole point of, or part of the purpose of developing stories is like it's something you can complete in one iteration, because like
Ideally.
the customer probably like wants it. So like, what if you have like a story that the customer deems to be really important and it can't actually be one story? You have to break it up.
Yeah, so the question was, if the whole goal is to prioritize, understand what the customer wants and prioritize the important things, what if the customer's most important high priority story is complex enough that you have to break it up and you won't finish all the pieces in one iteration? That is called, your team has a limited amount of engineer hours, and sometimes you got to tell the customer, I understand this is a really important story, it's going to take us 2 iterations to do it. And sometimes you can say, by the end of the first iteration, we will have finished this much of the story, and we could show you a demo of that much just to make sure that we're on the right track. But understand that it's a certain amount of work, and we won't be able to finish the whole thing until 2 iterations. Okay? But that's, I think, one of the key things about Agile is you kind of just pointed it out. You sort of never trade quality for anything else. There's a process by which you do things in a disciplined way, and sometimes a non-negotiable side effect of that process is you cannot do as much as the customer would have liked. A classic trade-off that I hope you never make is you could say, well, we had to split the story into 2 pieces. If we didn't have to write tests for all that stuff, we could finish both pieces this week. But if we also have to make sure that we have good test coverage and the code is nice and clean and people have reviewed it, well, that's going to take longer, and then we can only finish one of the pieces this iteration. You will save yourself so much grief and pain if you make the hard choice now of getting what appears to be less work done, because it isn't really less work. If you deliver only half of the total story, but that half of the story has tests that you know are solid, the code has been reviewed by other team members so there aren't like silly bugs hiding in it, you're going to save so much time in the future by not having to go back and fix stuff that should have worked the first time. There is no worse feeling than having the customer say, I tried the thing you said, but when I tried it, it blew up or it did the wrong thing. You're going to feel awful. Like, you'll get over it, but it's bad. So the part of the Agile process is understanding that it's not just the bare minimum code to get something to work. It's let's do it right. Because otherwise, in the long run, you end up wasting time going back to fix stuff that was done sloppily. Probably every team is going to do that at least once, and my hope is that the lesson will be so bitter that you'll never do it again. But I won't lie to you. I used to do it the same way. This way of building software has absolutely changed my life, but I did not always do it this way. And now that I do it this way, I cannot imagine what I was thinking when I did it not this way. Okay.
Okay, I want to pause it here because that's something I really want to bring up. Even though always the ideal way is like the professor has said, always include tests, and then even if that means just get half of the stuff done, having the test is still better. But in real life, again, that's not something you always have to say. Because business is business, and then a developer team, especially in a business that's not that much technical, or if it's not tech driven, you don't have that much authority to say no to that kind of thing. You cannot really say, I don't want the trade-off, and most likely what happens is you have to take the trade-off and deliver the 2 features and left out the tests. Sometimes that happens, and that's all it's life. And especially with the ministries I see, and it's actually not just technical side of things. It's not just something just related to softwares, developing softwares. Even other things, making purchases, develop some projects, develop buildings, develop set out companies, stuff, all this stuff like that. In many of our ministries, it's always pushed, and then it's always limited, and always go hard on time. So it's not just the software that's usually not tested, but also some others, and then there's always paying later that because it's not properly set up in the beginning, later into solve. But it's just kind of part of the ministries we will be working in, and that's also, I guess, part of the culture we're in. So yeah, many times we don't have the right to say no to it, and usually when it is pressed, we just have to deliver it. Even that means without proper setup, without proper testing, sometimes we just have to do it. It's just life. So have to take it when it happens. But again, on the other side of things, if a project is not that much pressed on time, or for a project that the stakeholder, the project owner, the leadership is okay with it to take some more time to set it up properly, to test it properly. Always try to do that. I would say that's always the ideal way of software development, and then it really helps in the long run to deliver quality software, as well save you a lot of effort and pain later down the line. All right, we will resume the video.
Okay. I'll stop proselytizing. If your team is not even completing a story per iteration, something's wrong. It might be that your stories are still too large, or it might be that something about your team process is not functional. But it's worth investigating. If you're not delivering a story each iteration, and my hope is that most teams here will be delivering several stories per iteration. All right, onward to the letter R. Relevant. How do you know that the story has business value? Because presumably if the customer says, I want it to do this, they know their business and there's some reason they want to do that. Now, you don't want to second guess them and say, well, okay, prove that it has business value. But a gentle way that you can probe to see why this story, why are they prioritizing this story, is you could try asking the why 5 different times. So for this story about showing the patrons Facebook friends, if I'm the box office manager or whatever, and you're talking to me and saying, Mr. Box Office Manager, why is it so important that you have this feature where people can see who's their friends who are going to the show? I could say the reason I want that is I think people will buy more tickets if they can see who's going. And you say, oh, that makes sense. Not to be stupid, but why do you want people to buy more tickets? Well, if people buy more tickets, then the theater does better, and the theater will be able to put on better productions. And okay, and if the theater put on better productions, what would that mean? It's like, well, then we could attract even more people, and those paying customers actually could pay my salary because I need to get paid. And why do you need to get paid? Well, okay, at this point you're starting to hit bottom, right? Eventually they'll say something like, well, if I don't get paid, no one runs the theater, and then it goes out of business. So that's maybe a little bit extreme. You don't always have to get to 5, but if you can get through 5, then you're good, right? It's basically a way of forcing both of you not to sort of second guess the customer and saying, well, I don't know if you really know your business. It's about help us, the team, the technical team, help us understand your business, because the better we understand your business, the better position we'll be in. For example, if we can't do the whole story, we'll have more information about your business, and we can figure out maybe how to prioritize pieces of it that will give you part of the benefit or something. Okay? So this is a nice, simple way to sort of get to the bottom of business value, and it's one way to measure relevant. And the last was time boxed. You got to know when to give up. If you've budgeted a certain amount of time for a story, you're coming up on the end of the iteration, you feel.
Okay, pause again to talk about the relevance part, or the why question. So in my opinion, it's actually really important to answer these whys. If you read the other recommended book, which is the Mythical Mammoth, right in the intro, the author talked about the alignment of goals in the importance of the goal alignment in the dev team. And then, interesting enough, the author used the example of the Babel Tower, where because God changed everyone's language, everyone won't be able to communicate, and then the project collapsed. But more important than that is the goals. When people are aligned with the goal that we're doing, with what we're doing, the project tends to be more successful, and then and that's why even if it's just a developer that implements a specified function, it's also beneficial for someone like that to understand the goal, and then it's really it's beneficial for the product to be successful. And the other thing I sometimes see is by communicating the goal, because when we have a goal, there's always multiple methods we can achieve the goal, right? And then by explaining the goal, sometimes the development team can come up with creative solutions that could, let's say, save time, or suggest a solution that's more effective in terms of achieving the goal. So by communicating the goals in a user story, of course it first helps the team to understand what we're trying to do with the user story, or by implementing a function. It helps to align the team. And it kind of, there's a good chance that it will be able to empower the team to come up with creative solutions, which can, again, more effectively achieving the goal, rather than what you usually see when you outsource a project to a freelancer or a outsourcing company. What they usually just care about is getting paid, right? And then what you will see, they will just do exactly, if you have a specification, they will just do exactly according to the specification with minimal effort. Just since they're just getting paid for the specification, so as long as they can deliver stuff according to the specification, they don't care, right? So they just try to maximize their revenue. That's what you see. And then, especially for small budget projects, usually stuff happens like that. But because of that, if there's stuff that's not specified, even though that's so obvious, it may be left out or may be missed by the development team. However, on this other side, for the project or the freelancer or the outsourcing company, if it's more expensive and more on the high budget kind of project, then usually you are looking for partners. You're not just looking for workers that does things according to what you say, and then somehow try to game you because all they care about is revenue, versus a partner. Partner is someone or some company or some entity that's aligned with your goal, understands your priority, and then even try to come up with solutions that may not be specified by you on your side. So yeah, that's the other benefits, an important benefit I see by explaining why, and think about that in your user story. However, again, that's something unique, I think, in our ministries and some of our companies, is that sometimes we don't really understand why, and even the stakeholders or the product manager, the product owner or product manager, may not exactly understand why. It could be just an assigned project by higher management, right? So in that case, I don't have a solution, honestly, and And when that happens, it happens again. That's life. So, but whenever it's possible, I really think it's beneficial to also. So by having the user story, it kind of explains the reason why we implement that feature, and it helps the developer to think and then to develop as the user, not as a developer. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, we will finish the video. Move on.
Like you're just grinding against the wall, nothing's happening, give up and get help. Talk to your coach, talk to me, figure out why you were not successful in predicting whether you'd be able to finish that story. Is it that it was too big? Is it that it turns out that the story is blocked on other stories? Like it depends on other things in the app that aren't working yet, and maybe that's the reason. And at that point, whatever's left undone, that's going to be sort of refactored into new stories that probably will get pushed into the next iteration. You can't win them all. We're going to use a tool called Pivotal Tracker, which tracks not how many stories you've done, but basically a weighted sum of stories by how hard they are. We're going to talk about that next. But the general idea behind time boxing is you don't just sort of let it drag on forever being undone. If it's not done by the end of the iteration, that's a moment to ask why. And that's something that your team will do at a retro or a retrospective meeting, which you're going to do at the end of every iteration saying what went well and what didn't. And that's where things like this might come up.
Okay, that's the video. Talks more about user story and what makes a user story good. Moving on. Next one.
Lo-fi sketches and storyboard. This is where it starts to get fun. And as a reminder, here's our picture again, and now we're in that second yellow step. We were just up here about how you work with a customer to formulate stories. Now that you have a description on an index card or something kind of at that level, what do you do next? The next thing you do is you start thinking about the user experience of whoever the stakeholder is that you're developing that story with. What is the experience that they're going to have when they use the feature? So sometimes I call this the code you wish you had. And in particular, you want to avoid the situation of this unpronounceable acronym, which is short for what I said but not what I want. So words only get you so far, but if your app is human-facing, what they're going to be interacting with is probably more than just an index card. So again, we're going to steal great ideas from the HCI community and build a lo-fi prototype. Lo-fi means really low, like whiteboard or pencil and paper. You'll notice that that is about the lowest possible phi you can imagine. We don't know what, you could imagine making a web page that kind of looks like that, but there's nothing here about styling or fonts or colors or any gingerbread. Whoops, sorry about that. Does anybody know that there's kind of a standard UI reason why you do it this way, by the way? There are a number of reasons to do it this way, but does anyone want to suggest why this is actually more effective when you're working with a customer than trying to do like a nice, you drew it in Adobe Illustrator kind of a thing? Or whatever people use these days? Yeah?
Is it faster to iterate on?
It's certainly faster to iterate on, so that's one thing. What else? Yeah?
Lowers their expectations.
It lowers their expectations. And yes, I did get that on camera. But it lowers their expectations, but it lowers them in the right way, right? Because what it says is, we're focused on the qualitative aspects of what this is going to look like. We're not focused on, I really prefer if you use, Comic Sans instead of Times. Things like that, where at this level, you're trying to figure out how to build something that behaves the way they want, right? Hence the B in BDD. So if a lo-fi UI sketch is sort of a very kind of coarse representation of a page, let's say, then the next step up from that is a sequence of pages, because most things the customer will do with your app, if they're interacting through a browser, will be multiple steps. So if you think about, if you know about how movies are done, a storyboard is one of the early phases where sort of key scenes in the movie are sketched out, and you kind of look at the static scenes to see the progression of the action. So storyboards in user-facing apps are very similar, except the scenes might not always be in a linear sequence. For example, you might say that the example storyboard for adding a new movie is if you start from the page where, where all the movies are listed, and there's some sort of a link or button that says add new movie, then if the user clicks that, the green arrow says, so now you're going to be taken to this other page, which is the one that looks kind of like where you fill in some stuff. There's a save button, and if you press the save button, you'll see maybe some sort of a confirmation screen that echoes back what you just entered. And finally, that confirmation page has another link, like go back to the main list, and there you are. So very simple, right? It's a series of essentially little panels. And you can make this elaborate too, but you can do things like if there's places where a pop-up would appear, you can have like a little piece of paper cut out and say, oh, when you do that, you'll see this pop-up. But again, it's very simple technology that it's more than enough for you and the customer to come to some agreement on what is desired. And it's pretty clear, like unlike a nice mock-up that you would draw with a professional tool or even display in a browser, we had this problem in the class a couple of years ago where the students thought, well, if the app is going to be using HTML pages anyway, we'll just do the mock-up in HTML. I mean, it's not that hard. Once you get used to using Bootstrap in HTML, you could actually do that in a few minutes. And the problem is the customer was interacting with a mock-up and clicking the button. They're like, nothing's happening, right? And it's because we hadn't lowered their expectations. They saw it in the browser. They saw buttons and things that they could interact with, and they assumed that what they were seeing was a prototype. Clearly, if you're seeing this, there's no code, right? So there's no expectation that it will work if you try to interact with it. Again, used in real life, this is a whiteboard photo from the same company that I showed you their Kanban board before. And you can see that they've got little sort of sketched out, I'm sorry the photo turned out blurry, it was a bad phone. But they've basically got exactly these kind of little sketches that are very schematically oriented. It's just enough for the devs and the customer to kind of come to agreement on roughly what the thing is going to look like. Okay, so again, it's sort of a discount method of coming to agreement with the customer. You can then convert those things to HTML. Well, I don't know. But if you start by the sketches and storyboards instead of doing HTML, you'll get all these benefits. Like it's less intimidating because it's clearly just a rough sketch. The customer might feel bad asking you to change it if it looks like a lot of work went into it. But if it's just a pencil drawing, they're not going to feel bad saying, oh, could you move that field up to the top or something like that. Again, if the stakeholders are non-technical, there's no way they're going to confuse this for a working prototype. They're more likely to suggest changes if they don't feel like oh wow, you've already invested time to build all this stuff. I'm not going to, it's fine the way it is, don't worry about it. And they're more likely to focus on the interaction, right? The experience of using the feature instead of details like visual appearance, which really can be filled in later. And as we all know, using a tool like Bootstrap for those of us who are graphically impaired gets you, it'll give you a good enough prototype that it'll kind of look like the thing that you mocked up with them. So this is a great approach. It's easy to do, totally fun. And don't take my word for it. Remember I said these top 10 slides are feedback from the previous generation of 169 students who just took this class with me last year. And this is, the green comments are people who did something that we suggested and found that it worked. The red comments, which is the bottom two on this slide, are comments from people who wish they had done something differently. And notice, people who actually spent time doing the prototypes, in some cases, it turns out the customer didn't like it, and they had blown a lot of effort that really went nowhere. And this bottom one, which is why we're focusing on getting people to understand smart user stories, never realize how challenging it is to get from customer description to technical plan. If there's one sentence that sums up what most people say they learn in this class, it's that last one. Okay? But again, these are the actual unedited words from your fellow students who took this class a year ago now. So take them for what it's worth.
Okay, some quick comments on that. Basically, this video introduces us introduce another tool that we typically use during the design phase. That is the storyboard, or sometimes we call it wireframes. It's basically a stripped out version of the UI design of the application. So it depends. Some projects. So for large project, typically you do the cucumber or the user story first, which are just plain English, and then work with the customer or the stakeholder to kind of draft out or sketch the UI to have an actual visual feeling of what we're working on or what will be delivered by joining these wireframes and user stories, the storyboards. It basically mocked up, sketches for each pages, and then the links, how it will link to each other. For me, there was one big project that used this workflow. Although I skipped the user story part, just got straight into the wireframe and storyboard. And I would say the development experience for that project was really great. Because otherwise, sometimes you will see is a application, the request will come and then it's sent directly to the graphic design team to directly start the design the web page, the look of the web page. But then what we typically see missing from a graphic designer is that although it can be very visually appealing in terms of the layout, the color, the font, all that, some behavior may be missing. For example, like when if a user logged in, the graphic design of the web page may not even have a log out button, and then there might be elements in the graphic design that doesn't really make sense when we actually implement it. For example, there can be a link to something that appears to be linking to something, but the feature has not been designed, not been included even in the requirements, and it won't be implemented. The landing page or the target page won't be implemented. Then having that link in, for example, a home page of the application, it totally doesn't make sense. So yeah, basically I want to say that's also a great tool to use. I'm talking about the storyboard and the wireframe or the lo-fi mockup, whatever you call it. It can basically help you to visually communicate the desired outcome of a desired behavior of the application. Although I want to say that it also has its limitation, especially when it comes to mobile application. Although this course is pretty much designed, all the examples are designed for SaaS application or web application, but when we try to adopt that to mobile application, the tricky thing is stuff like animation, stuff like loading, because when we get to like a mobile application, what makes a application feels native in a mobile setting is that it has all kinds of smooth animations, and that's how it differentiates itself from a web-based mobile application. Because usually what you see in a cheap mobile-based application, web-based mobile application, is basically embedding a browser, or it feels like opening a page in a mobile browser, and then when I click something, it basically reloads the page, and that's usually what we don't want to see, or it makes user feels terrible in a mobile application setting. But with a lo-fi mockup or a storyboard or wireframe, it's usually difficult to communicate something like animation. And the other thing I mentioned is stuff like loading. So if it's a front-end heavy application, then it depends on some third-party or external API to retrieve information. then typically what you see, there's when the API is when the front end is waiting for the API call to respond. There's typically a brief moment of loading state where the page just show like a bunch of placeholders and maybe a progress bar that keeps progressing, or a circle loading, a loading circle or something like that. But sometimes it's also to communicate a state like that for a front-end heavy application. But there are ways we can work around that in Mockup. If we're going through the mockups or the wireframes in a meeting, then we could always just say, hey, there should be an animation in it, just like what's in the video already mentioned. If there need a pop-up, we can just cut out a piece of paper and show, hey, there should be a pop-up after clicking that. But again, it requires a meeting, and it requires some extra communication to make sure it's the idea is delivered. All right, so that's the second thing we've talked about, a storyboard or wireframe that basically visualize the desired behavior. And in the ideal scenario, the development team and the front-end team and the design team should work together with the client to agree on that. Although sometimes we see is the request gets straight to the graphic design team to figure out the layout and UI before sent to the actual developer. So sometimes it happens. When it happens, it happens. But I want you all know that there's a good way to do it by involving the dev and design team together in this phase. All right, let's move on.
So let's talk about progress, points and velocity. Again, a concept that is not particularly difficult to get a hold of, but if you've never done it before, you got to get your brain thinking in this mode. So, in the real world, if you have a customer who's paying you to do stuff, they can reasonably ask, what will it cost and how long will it take? And in plan and document methods, as we remember, a lot of work goes into those first couple of phases where you basically are developing this master plan according to which everything in theory will be done, although it often doesn't work out that way. But in Agile, if you're sort of doing things as you go in small steps, how do you estimate the overall cost of a project or when it's going to be done? And can things like user stories be used as a way to do that? Can we use them as the unit of doing work or the unit of productivity? In fact, Pivotal Labs, from which we steal many good ideas that we try to foster in this course, we asked them at one point, well, when you work with a client, because they build software by and with their client very much in the style that you're going to do, they have a team that becomes, in some sense, an appendage of the client and learns enough about the client's business to really become a partner in making something work for them. And what do they not do? They don't say, OK, give us the list of features you want. We'll come back with a date and a number of dollars. That is not how Pivotal Labs gives estimates. Instead, they say, we will work with you, the customer, because we're partners in this, in the most efficient way that we know how, that we've developed this methodology around Agile and planning and so forth. And they have a sort of an orientation with the customer where they explain to the customer what we are going over right now. Like, this is the way that we're going to work together. Every week, we're going to get together. We're going to brainstorm about features. We're going to show you some sketches. We'll give you estimates for how long those week's features will take to be done. Ideally, they'll be done that week. And then they have another meeting to sort of learn the customer's business and scope the project. Mostly what they're trying to do is identify elements of the project that are not like any project they've ever done, because those are the ones most at risk. For example, if the customer's app needs a login flow connected to login with Google, they've probably done that enough times that they have a good sense of how long and how much effort that takes. But if the customer needs to integrate their app with some legacy system that has been running in the basement since 1985, who knows what that entails, right? That might be easy or it might be a nightmare. So you try to identify places that are least like anything you've done before. And then the engineers sort of go off and they do some estimation based on the same techniques we will use. They've just done it a lot more, so they've gotten very good at it. And then basically they just kind of give you a time window based on how many sources of uncertainty they had. So the process they use is very much the process that you're going to use. It's just the first time you use it, it feels weird. Okay? But it's real life. And what they come back with is they take the sort of pessimistic version of their estimate and they say, we think it'll be about this much. But it's not a binding contract where, if we don't deliver everything by that date, then you get to fire us. Right? So part of what they do is try to help the customer understand that to the extent that this app has specific, unique needs of that customer, that's where the uncertainty is, and that's where their commitment is really about the way that they work and having the customer be engaged with them, not about, we're going to focus on a contract being signed that says what we're going to deliver in how many weeks. So how do they and how will we measure productivity? Obviously, just doing sort of number of stories doesn't really work because some stories might be a lot less complicated to implement than others. So instead, we'll do something very simple. We're going to give each story a number of points, and that will be your team's estimate of how complicated or how difficult that story will be, how much effort it will require in order for that story to be done. There are many different ways to do point scales. Some people just do linear, like 1, 2, 3, 4. Some people do geometric, which is what we recommend, which is 1, 2, 4, 8. Some people use Fibonacci series and other interesting things. But basically, the reason that we like the geometric scale is it really reflects the risk you're taking on uncertainty. People ask, how much is a point? Like, is a point, 2 hours of a coder? Is it 2 hours of a pair working together? There's sort of no fixed definition of what a point should be. The important part is that everybody in the team agrees on what it is. So a guideline might be something like, if you're doing pair programming, a pair of people who are working together for a 3-hour or a 4-hour programming session, that's 1 point. And maybe that'll be different on different teams, but the goal is over time, as your team sort of gets to know their working style, you can stabilize what a point means to you. Because this is what you're going to do when you do planning meetings, which I'll describe in a moment. So a 1-point story, like when I am doing pointing for myself, for me a point is if I sit down and plan to work for 2 or 3 hours, I can finish it. Maybe it'll be 4 hours. Maybe it'll be a little more. Maybe it'll be a little less. But I won't need to give up and come back to it tomorrow. So for me, 1 point is 1 coding run at the keyboard. 2 points is like, OK, maybe it's like most of a day of work with a lunch break in between. Hopefully I don't have to carry it over to the following day. That's 2 points. 4 points, once I get above 2 points, I'm really admitting to myself that I actually don't know how many points it is. If I can sort of imagine how I'm going to spend my time for a point or for a 2-point story, but a 4-point story is saying, OK, even like if it goes beyond 1 day of programming, do I really know how I'm going to be spending, if I'm doing 2 days of coding, how many hours of testing is that? How many hours of debugging? How many hours of looking up stuff on the internet to learn how some library works because I've never used it before? So I like the 1, 2, 4, 8 scale because it forces you to confront that if you say 4, you really don't know. If you say 4, you should really be breaking down the story into pieces until you're comfortable with those pieces being like 1 or 2. If you say 8, we will disallow it. We're going to try to configure the tool to forbid you from doing 8-point stories because you have no idea how much 8 points really is. I don't think anybody really does. It's the problem with software. So over time, the goal is that your team will get to where you sort of get to know each other's skills, and 1 point will have a pretty consistent meaning across all the people on your team.
Right, so that's about making estimations and estimated costs of like a user story or feature. We will actually touch on that a bit more later when we talk about project management. So then, next video.
You'll have a meeting every week after you've had your session with the customer where you will sit with your team, and your goal is to go through the stories that came out of that meeting and estimate how hard they are. We have a tool that will help you do this, by the way. The product owner, who we'll talk about a little bit later, this is the person who sort of, when the customer is not in the room, they are the voice of the customer, and you're going to rotate that role each iteration, goes through one story at a time, and people vote independently on how hard, how many points they think that story ought to be worth. There's a number of different ways to do it. We're going to recommend that you use one called Planning Poker, which we have a tool that is built in. It's basically like rock, paper, scissors. So everybody sort of thinks for about a minute. They think this, and then you go, OK, 1, 2, 3, and everybody puts down a card showing some number of points. And if your team is getting to where like everybody puts down the same card, that's great. The only improvement on that I can think of is if it actually turns out you're correct, which you will get better at over time. Typically, you will not all agree, and that's where the discussion comes in to say, OK, I thought it was 1. You thought it was 4. Why do you think it's a 4-point story? And at some point, you come to convergence. Or if not, maybe you just take the pessimistic vote and say, all right, you've convinced me that it might be a harder story than I think. We're going to call it 4 points, and let's think about subdividing it. Remember when you're doing this that the goal is for the team to get to convergence. So some team members may have more experience with certain things. They may say, oh, yeah, I know the JavaScript to do that. That's not hard. Let me be part of the pair that works on that story. And if we do it, it's a 1-point story. And that's legit. But at the same time, anybody who has a doubt about that should always feel like it's safe to speak up and disagree. Because at the end of the day, it's really the whole project that suffers if the team is not sort of working as a cohesive unit. Okay, so take advantage of the skills that your team members have, and sort of respect that some people have more strength. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that those people should like unilaterally determine what the effort is for a particular story. Like I said, if your story is higher than 4 points, oh, I'm so sorry. Question.
If someone knows if it's that situation where someone's like, oh, this is a 1-point thing for me, and other people are like, oh, it's 4 points. Do you then how do you decide how the work is split up? Do you do a pair program and then have someone who doesn't really know how to do it be with that person?
So a question is, if you have a situation like this where one person who's very experienced at something says, oh, for me, that would be a 1-point story, there's a number of things you could do. I think it's a good idea to say, OK, be one of the pair, but work with someone who doesn't know that technology as well. And then next time we have a story that's similar, there'll be 2 people who feel like it's a 1-point story. So using pairing as a way to spread knowledge throughout the team. I think it's self-defeating to say, well, OK, you're the expert on that, but we're going to have somebody else do it so that they learn it. I mean, there's some pedagogical value to that, but it seems a little bit hard-headed to me. So I think if you keep remembering that you're all working toward the same goal, and yeah, that means that in that pair programming session, one person may be doing sort of a lot more of the forward progress, but that's OK. The other person's still learning. So I would use it as an opportunity to spread more knowledge throughout the team so that as you get into the later iterations, you all sort of are being brought up to comparable levels. Good question. Yes?
Do you ever say no to the customer, for example, if he wants to build Google's PageRank algorithm into his app? When do you start saying no, then his feature cannot be implemented?
When do you start saying no? You start saying no when you actually take these suggestions back to your team and they're like, oh, that's a 38-point story. We won't be done until next semester. No, but the reality is that if the it depends on how specific the customer is, right? If they say something like, we want magic searching on our site, you have the right to say, well, we're going to need a more specific version of the story than that, because otherwise we can't even estimate it. So do you want us to go find some engine that does searching and plug it into the app? Maybe that's what you want. Maybe what you really want is for us to do an integration with Google Enterprise and have the website search become part of your site. That's a specific thing. We can go off and estimate how hard that would be to do. But yeah, sometimes if the customer is asking for the moon, you have to say no, right? Or you have to say that's for the constraints of this team and this project, we don't believe we can deliver a good job on that.
Another quick pause here. So I do want to bring up that sometimes, even though it's hard, but you have to say no to certain requests, because although sometimes it's not specific enough, we could address that. But sometimes even without more specification, we can know it's just a moonshot with the limited resources. And sometimes say no is hard, especially faith setting in Christian ministries, because many times we have to say yes, and then trust God. But honestly, with software, like unless we are going to borrow a team from Google, which won't happen, or purchase some third-party libraries that could fulfill the functionality. But that aside, typically everything needs to be implemented by the actual developer, by writing the actual code, which for sure will take time, and then code won't just appear like magic. So even though sometimes it can be hard, especially in certain contexts, sometimes the leader or the management will just say, hey, have faith and do it. And then, hey, can we press more on the timeline? Like if your estimate, you say the estimate, okay, it's like 2 weeks, hey, can we do it in 1 week? Sometimes you will see that. But sometimes you can just put some extra hours, do some over hours, right? Spend some more time working on that in the evening, in the weekends. You may be able to make up for the schedule. But there are really certain things, certain requests that's just moonshot, that's just impossible. And then when that time comes, kind of you have to act as the bad guy, and then say no to it, because otherwise it will be just a lose-lose situation, where if you don't communicate the idea that the task is impossible, and the product owner, whoever wants that, won't really realize it's not possible, and then by saying yes to stuff that actually should be no, when the deadline hits, things won't be delivered, everybody won't be happy, and just it's a bad situation. So before things get too bad, I tend to just, if it has to be, I would just be the bad guy and say no to certain requests, because it simply just won't happen. Sometimes stuff can work out for things like, can we have the timeline, but for other things like build a search engine like Google in a week, then that's simply impossible, and we have to say no to it. And then typically what happens when you get really serious about that, and then it's really a no or impossible task, that whoever requested it will begin to think about that and then revise the request, either make it more specific or make some schedule that's more realistic, and cut down some of the features that's more advanced, or something that's for later. So that's typically how I deal with a situation like that. But what I want to say is, like, as a developer, really you should have the ability to say no, even though it may look like, especially in a Christian or faith setting, it may make you look like a person without great faith, right? 'Cause, many times we say, let's do that, and then say amen, and then just do it. But for software, it doesn't always happen like that. It's not like some big bill purchases where we can, although these also are grace of God, we can borrow money, we can get loans, but for software, there's just no such thing as borrow some code or have Google to write code for us, and then pay them back later. It's just not a thing in software. So yeah, that's about scheduling, and then when it's time to say no, just say no. All right, let's resume the video.
And there's no shame in doing that. Okay, last couple of things on points. So as I said, the main thing about points, it's not a race to see which team is doing the most points per iteration. The goal is for your team to get consistent so that over time, your ability to estimate, okay, how much is a point and how many points do we think we're likely going to be able to do in an iteration, and then you actually compare. The tool Pivotal Tracker, which I'll introduce you to next time, will keep track of all of this for you as you work on stories. And the goal is that by the end of the course, you're actually getting pretty good at estimating how hard something will really be. A related concept about this that we haven't talked too much about, and maybe this also goes to your question, is the concept of a spike. So the customer says something like, well, I want to have a recommendation algorithm that when someone's shopping on my site that can recommend similar things that other people liked. OK, well, unless somebody on your team is already an expert on recommendation algorithms and plugins or libraries that they can use, if that's a legitimate customer request, someone on your team is going to have to learn about that. And this is when you say, all right, we're going to need to set aside some time, maybe one engineer day or one pair of engineers day, and they're going to do whatever it takes to learn about that. They're going to write crappy code, they're going to hack things, they're going to download stuff, and they're all going to do it in such a way that when they're done, they throw out all that code and they come back to the team meeting and say, OK, now we know how to do it. This is what it takes. We found 4 different recommendation algorithm engines that we can plug in. This is how hard we think it would be to do the integration with the existing app. And now you can actually go back to your planning meeting. So sometimes you'll have to sort of take a detour and say, we don't have the expertise in the team, but give us a couple of days and we'll get back to you with an estimate of how hard that would really be to do. OK, so and by the way, when you do find yourself doing a spike, that's a great time to come to your GSIs or to us or Piazza, as well as Stack Overflow, because we may be able to recommend ways that you can speed up the process. We may have some pointers on where you can start your research. This is kind of the part of the course where a lot of students sort of tend to, I don't want to say tune out, but they tend to devalue it a little bit because we're not talking about code. Although actually today we are going to talk about some code. But what we found very consistently in this class is that when projects come, the student teams that do the best on the projects in general, the ones that have good progress, a happy customer, they feel like they're sort of functioning as a well-oiled machine and doing good work, it's because they have a handle on this front-end part of the process, the planning and estimating part. If you do a poor job on that, if you don't really think about how to break up stories and how to assign points, our experience has been that that's likely to translate into an inability to sort of consistently deliver solid stories by the end of the iteration. So we have a nice full house, and let's take advantage of it. So Pivotal Tracker is one of the 28 zillion tools we're throwing at you this semester, so welcome to real life. Its dashboard looks something like this. In fact, what I'll do is, I'll give you a real example of a dashboard from one of my own tracker projects. OK, so this is a dashboard from one of my own tracker projects. And basically, the goal of this tool is to allow the tracking and partial automation of the process we talked about in the last session, where you're coming up with stories, you're chunking them into pieces, you're estimating how many points you think those pieces might be worth, and then tracking who's working on those stories. So the basic idea behind the tracker dashboard is there's 3 basic columns that show up. There's various ways to customize it, but we have sort of a recommended setup that we're going to publish. In our recommended setup, there's the icebox, the backlog, and current. So icebox is basically where do you put user stories that came out of a customer meeting, so stuff you know you have to do, but it has not necessarily been prioritized yet. You don't know which ones are most important. It has not necessarily had a point estimate assigned to it yet, so you haven't gone through the exercise with your team of figuring out how complex they are. Once a story becomes pointed and prioritized, it can move into the backlog. The backlog, the big difference compared to the icebox is these are stories that are in priority order. So if it's higher up in the backlog, it is more important, and it needs to be done before stuff that's lower in the backlog. Even if the stuff lower in the backlog looks cool because it's adding JavaScript-y animations, the stuff at the top is what, because the customer meeting, you have all agreed is what deserves priority. So as people from the team or pairs from the team start picking up work to do, they really should be picking it up in the order from top to bottom in the backlog. Everything in the backlog has had a person assigned to it, or a pair if you're doing pair programming, and it has a point estimate assigned to it. Number of points, depending on which scale you use. We're recommending the geometric 1, 2, and 4 scale. You can see that some things in the backlog have this little bug symbol next to them. Those are actually not new stories. Those are bugs. And in a minute, we'll talk about the similarities and differences between how you use this to manage stories, which is basically about adding new functionality, versus how you use it to manage bugs, which is fixing stuff that arguably should have been got right when you did the story in the first place. Okay? So that's the basic tracker setup. You can open each one of these. Oops, there we go. If you open a story, there's a panel where you can you can edit various properties of the story, the number of points. I'm the only person on this project right now, so it's going to get assigned to me when it does get assigned. Right now, it doesn't have an owner. You can slide stories up and down to reprioritize them. This is a live project, so I'm not going to be doing that. When you're ready to start a story, so it's been prioritized, it's been assigned to somebody, it has a point value estimating how hard it is. Whoever is picking up that story will click the start button. That moves the story over into the current iteration, which is the last of the 3 panels, and it's what you're doing now. So every story that some programmer or pair of programmers is actively working on will find its way into the current iteration column after you've clicked the start button. And in a moment, we'll go through what the different values, accept, reject, finish, what do all these different things mean? Because in terms of the way you run your project, they have very specific meanings. Okay, so that's an overview of what it looks like. Let's talk about what it does for you, I suppose. Rather
Okay, I have to pause it right there. Due to our limited time, we still have like 15, 13, 14 minutes left. So we won't be able to finish this video. We will catch up in next lecture, which will happen Thursday next week. So before we end this lecture, I want to talk about the homework for these 2 weeks, because we are just having 2 lectures in these 2 weeks. So it's our chance to catch up on the homeworks, and then show you a little demo, because the instruction for that homework isn't that clear. So I want to make sure everyone understands what we're doing for that hands-on practice. Actually, we should have the practice next lecture, but we may not have the time to do that. But anyway, we'll see. So I will now show how to get the homework going for this week. Oopsie. So the homework for this week, the basic option is again write a summary. So for last week it was for a summary for chapter 6. So this week is going to be for chapter 7, which is basically the chapter for BDD, or behavior driven design. So that's the basic option. And for the bonus option, you are going to write codes using Cucumber, which is basically a testing framework that converts a user story, what we've talked about for BDD, and converts that to a integration test or functionality test. So you can get that by following the link here. As usual, what you will do is fork it, and I've forked it already. Let me grab my terminal. Okay, you should be able to see the terminal now. Clone that code. Then I've already have it, so I'm gonna remove it. So after clone it, you would see that in the README file it says nothing about you are supposed to do. And what you are supposed to do is actually, if you go to the features directory, you should see 2 files, and that's exactly the user story what we've talked about. So one user story for filter movie list, and then another user story for sort movie list. All right. So before I do that, let me actually launch the dev server. So first install the dependency, as we would do. Run the db migrate, I believe. db migrate to set up the database. And then start the server. And then you should be able to see a site like that. That's basically what you are supposed to do. So if you finish the week four, right? Yeah, if you've done the week 4 homework, the week 4 homework is to basically build this rotten potato barebone site from scratch using Rails framework. So if you've done that homework, you should already have a site that's close to what you're looking now at here. So you could actually either continue implementing this assignment using what you have already done, the code base for homework 4, or the safer way is just to clone this skeleton project and then start from there. So either way we'll do it. And then basically here we're talking about, so let me go back to features. So we're talking about implementing the feature to filter the movie list. So the UI is already here. As you can see, I'm highlighting it up there. So right now these checkboxes doesn't do anything. So basically you're supposed to implement that and make sure if a certain type or category is checked, the movie list should only show the filtered results. Of course, this is a fresh database, so it doesn't have the movie, but you can just, for testing, for development, you can just add a few more movies by adding new movie, by clicking that button here. And then the other feature is sort movie list. Basically, you can see up here these table headers. Some of these table headers are clickable. So by clicking that, we want this page to sort the result by these specific fields. And then if you open these features or user stories, these are basically Cucumber files. Although in today's video we haven't touched on Cucumber yet. But you should already understand what is a user story, and each of these files is actually technically a user story. So it has the title of the feature, it has the background. So as a concerned parent, so that I can quickly browse movies appropriate for my family, I want to see movies. Basically explains why we want to implement this feature, which we've already mentioned in previous videos. And then we have the scenarios, which defines each step, clicking this, click that, and then I should see this, and then I should see that. Which will then further be translated into tests. And that's something you can see in here, these steps. So for example, if I have open movie steps, then everything related to, all the steps related to movie is defined here. Okay, so for example, go back to filter movie. So here, the background step is given the following movie exists, so you can see a table of movies. And then in the steps, movie steps, you can see the step definition, which is here, given the following movie exists. And then this is skeleton, so you need to implement that. And because there's a pending statement, this step is pending. So if I actually run the user story test, which I will do that now, execute cucumber. So this command will go through the feature, the user. What? Did the stream disconnect for a moment? Okay. Anyway, I'll go back and edit the video if that happened. So what you will do is delete this pending statement. So now if I run cucumber, you will see it passed. Because I didn't implement anything, so it didn't fail, so it actually passed. But the next task will fail. So then what you will do is implement that, which I already know what to do. So this is just an example. Do that. Execute. So the background task, the step should run, and then because I implemented it, it should actually create these records in the database. And so it test. I'm still on the stream. Okay. Where am I? So basically, you want to do all these step definition to make it pass. So besides implementing these step definition, you should also add more steps in these scenarios. Like here, it's also select skeleton. You are supposed to add more steps and define it. So yeah, that's it for this week's homework. You are supposed to basically edit the feature definitions and the step definitions, and then implement the defined features. All right, for more information on how to use Cucumber, you can find the learning materials here. And you could actually also just Google Cucumber IO. You can find the Cucumber sites, and there are also documentations and learning. There's resources on how to learn BDD, there are documentation, how to use it. It supports different languages, so because we're using Ruby on Rails, you will just click on this tab and follow documentation and get yourself started if you're not familiar with it. And then for next lecture, we will actually have some more videos that walks us through Cucumber. But because the timing, I just want to let you understand the assignment and homework first before we actually get to the video that talks about Cucumber. All right, so time is up, so we have to end. All right, so next lecture we'll talk more about BDD and Cucumber. So we'll call it for today. All right, so let's end the lecture and see you guys next week. Bye.